All right, Hark 3. So this was initially a podcast episode, which I had proposed that we angle around smart contracts. But when I started doing a little bit of research, and I will say that I did a little bit less research than I would have liked to on this one, so maybe you can carry the team a little bit today, but this much more became a thing. Like,
oh boy.
Yeah, right. This became much broader than smart contracts, and I really ended up focusing more on blockchain itself and sort of this added layer of complexity on top of blockchain being like this smart contracts piece. I still have a lot of questions about, so this will be maybe a question asking podcast and not a question answering podcast.
I don't know if I'm the expert on the blockchain, but
that's okay.
We'll see. I like that we're getting the little switch up in real time.
Yeah, surprise. But I don't know. I think that's fine, and I also think it's fine if this podcast episode is us asking questions and then pondering the answers to those questions. I won't claim to be an expert about anything that we talk about. So, yeah, I don't know. How did you find the research phase on this one?
I think when you said let's chat about smart contracts, my knee-jerk reaction, just because I had never really dabbled into it before, was how would I create one?
Okay, yeah.
And just seeing what that looks like. And it's definitely like, there's just a different world of software engineering when it comes to that type of technology. Because like, there's so many tools that like I would have never touched to approach that tool. Whether it be like kind of like these browser-based like IDE type things that are going to help with your development, the way in which Solidity, the programming language that one would use to create a smart contract,
would that browser-based? I don't know. You mentioned browser-based IDEs. This is a little bit outside of my realm of expertise. So Solidity is how you encode for a smart.
Solidity is a programming language.
It's a language.
Yeah, it's a programming language. And that is one of the ways in which you're going to interface with a blockchain. And just seeing like what that kind of looks like, how what your syntax looks like, how a contract is sort of constructed, and to me it kind of emulated something comparable to like a class and like object-oriented programming type thing, where a contract is going to have certain variables or like attributes. So one could define like a token in a contract and say, I want there to be X number of tokens. And maybe you'd say like, I want this number of tokens to be potentially minted. And then, from there on, you might have some functionality, like functions to mint new tokens that might be guarded by someone who's like a contract owner versus not a contract owner, being able to send or transfer funds. To me, like if you look at the code and you sort of abstract away, it's a different programming language. It looks pretty similar to what I would expect to be in like like any banking software. It's just the like back end, if you will, that it's interfacing with is decentralized as opposed to centralized. So I don't know. From a developer's perspective, there's probably some changes, right? But I feel like from an overall perspective, it kind of feels pretty similar once you've gotten past all the entry barriers, which I'm only so familiar with. But there's just like a whole different like development toolkit that you're going to leverage just to start writing code. But yeah, I was surprised by that because part of me was thinking like, oh, this is some like vast new technology. It's going to look a lot different.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I feel like some of the samples that I was finding looked pretty similar to what you'd expect, like normal, I don't know, like a normal financial application to kind of look like.
Yeah. So like, what would those similarities be? Is it like the basis agreement sort of revolving around the actual transaction itself?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the idea of a smart contract a lot of times, right, is creating some type of state machine where you're like, this is what we want to happen if something occurs. If not, something else is happening. It's just like a fancy like conditional that I guess can hold a little more like the way people talk about it is like we can use these for like grandiose things, such as insurance or voting or I don't know, whole bunch of different opportunities, right? And it kind of, I mean, it kind of feels a lot similar to generally when you talk about crypto. You land in this scenario where somebody's describing something to you that feels like it's sort of already happened, but it's happening in like a different way because it's decentralized. So I think the big thing to talk about when talking about smart contracts is DeFi and some more level of like, I'm probably going to botch this word, anonymity.
Yeah.
Being anonymous.
Yeah.
Which you are to an extent, right? I've also been thinking about that a little bit where like you're still recognized based off your public key when you're interacting with the blockchain. And you're also going to be seen by your IP. So some folks that will interact with the blockchain will do so behind a VPN to sort of try and promote more of that anonymity. But like anything, I feel like you can use context clues, like what a public key is interacting with, how they're interacting with something, and it's all public. Like that's one of the big selling points of crypto and blockchain is everybody can see what's going on. It's just anonymous. But I feel like if you're a sophisticated individual, you probably have capabilities to tie down a public key to somebody. Especially if you're like a more well-known individual. Like it makes me think of like the Elon Musk flight tracker or something like that.
Yeah.
Like I feel like it only takes a little bit more of extra work for somebody to create something like that for somebody's public key, and then maybe they get a new wallet, transfer to a different wallet. There's ways to like swap things up, but I don't know if we're to talk about like what are the benefits of leveraging blockchain versus the technology that largely exists today, which we're like there's a push to move to blockchain type technologies. Sometimes I end up scratching my head. I'm like, where's like the real benefit? Because
what's the value add?
They add anonymity as like a benefit, which I think a lot of cases is. In some cases, I think it can be maybe not a good thing because you could promote some interesting activity, I would imagine, on the blockchain, and then that leads into the main point is like it's not regulated because it's decentralized, and that's pointing to this idea that regulation as a whole is bad.
Yeah. A lot of thoughts around that last point. And a few questions around, or maybe just like thought-provoking questions around some of the stuff you've mentioned, but maybe it would be useful to take like a step back, sort of at a higher level, and discuss what we're referring to when we talk about smart contracts and kind of the ecosystem with which they live, within which they live. And so I think, this is probably a fair assumption that people understand what we're talking about, given that you and me are the only ones that listen to this. And even then, we probably don't even listen to it. But it might be useful to just sort of take a high level view of sort of what we're talking about. And I think this is sort of the basis of whatever research I did do come into this episode. And so I really want to get into some of the details that you've talked about. You've mentioned some really interesting stuff. But what I might offer, which answers one of your last questions, is the idea of anonymity and distributed networks versus what exists currently. I think this is a big piece of Chris Dixon's book, Read, Write, Own. And he's very much a proponent of blockchain and this sort of libertarian ethos in web development. And so the thesis of his book, which I'll try to summarize, having not finished the book yet, is that he describes the sort of evolution of the internet in three phases: the read phase, the write phase, and then the own phase. So he declares Web 1, the initial evolution of the internet, as this ecosystem in which it was very easy for users, general population users, to read what subject matter experts had published on the internet. But interacting with the internet wasn't really an easy thing to do. There was some level of technical expertise that was needed to be able to make changes or publish on the internet. And even in the early days of the internet, just accessing the internet took some level of technical expertise. I'm sure we just picked up Roger on the podcast, but that's fine. Yeah. And in the second phase, which is sort of what he would call Web 2, where we live now, it's very easy for commonplace users to interact with the internet. We can publish things on social media, or you can write a blog post, or you can send an email. It's very easy to write on the internet. You can make changes that exist on the internet and interface with it a little bit. It's interactive now. The context with which Chris Dixon applies this libertarian ethos is that in Web 2, this read era, there's this tendency towards centralized ownership of how people interface with the internet. And that sort of is becoming smaller and smaller. That ownership is sort of smaller and smaller. You've got the Facebooks of the world, the Googles of the world. TikTok is probably the newest, competitor in the ownership space on the internet. But the incentive for people to write apps over these existing behemoths, these sort of internet owners, is dwindling because they already have the benefits of network effects. So like Facebook has this massive network. They don't gain that much more by incentivizing a new creator to create on their space. They have a lot of creators, they have a lot of viewers, and that's what they need for their business model. Whereas from the perspective of a creator, you really do need a network effect to circulate your ideas if you want to become if you want your ideas to circulate, you need a network effect. And so you can try to gain that for yourself, which is very difficult. Or you can use some of these other systems that already exist. And the difficulty there is that because these large corporations that own big chunks of the internet have complete control over those chunks of the internet, they control take rates. So if you want to publish something on YouTube and monetize that content and earn money for what you've created, YouTube has complete control over how much they want to cut out of your income. Or if you want to publish an app on the App Store for Apple, you're looking at 30% overhead just for putting it on the App Store. And so there's a real lack of market competition because there's so few gigantic corporations who own most of the network effects, and gaining your own network effects is very, very difficult. Mm-hmm. The other piece of this is that if you want to go from one network to another, say you want to go from a YouTube publisher to a Facebook publishing ecosystem, taking all of your followers and transitioning them from one centrally owned network to another is usually not possible. It's not really enabled by the people that own these network effects, and that's by design. They don't want you to leave their platform. And so this is one of the angles that Chris Dixon publishes about as a major improvement, or there's potential for major improvement by transitioning to blockchain networks, which is that things like take rates are established and set in stone. They're a part of the blockchain. They're published. You can see them, and they're not changeable unless there's sort of this community consensus over changing them. They're distributed. They're not centrally owned, and so you can sort of overcome some of these issues with centralized networks like YouTube or Google or whatever. And that he mentions is the own era, where by decentralizing the network effect and participating in it, you gain some ownership over it in the form of a token. And so instead of having a centralized control over large network effects, you have sort of one gigantic network in which you can interface with transparency and some greater level of personal control. And that's the sort of improvement that he talks about. And so he puts this in the backdrop of his perception of the internet becoming more and more centrally owned. The internet's becoming a lot more narrow. People interfaced with very, very few, network owners, websites, essentially, compared to in the early days. It's sort of becoming monopolized by the social media giants and the search giants. And the sort of end game of that trajectory is probably pretty poor for your average content creator or just someone who wants to build a business on the internet. And so, like, if you're thinking even from like a funding standpoint, if someone's building an application that they think will become a feasible business, but they're doing so on top of a network that already exists, it'd be very hard to get funding on that for that application, simply because the whole ecosystem with which that application depends on could be yanked out from under them. If they're unable to, and so this has happened actually. Vine died in this exact way. I think that's the classic example. Is Vine was a Twitter application, I believe, and Twitter disallowed Vine to continue developing on top of their app. And so the software just died. And then, like, when TikTok took over, which was essentially Vine 2.0, they had this huge boom of success. And it's essentially the same content, it's the same thing, but they did it on their own platform, and they were able to gain a network effect, and that sort of allowed them to gain traction. But so I think that was a piece of it. Sort of the benefits of blockchain versus centralized internet ownership. So, like, that's the own era. There's a lot there, but even underneath that, just understanding what it means to be a contract on a blockchain was interesting. I like what you said about state systems. This was sort of a learning experience for me. When I learned about blockchains previously, you always get a similar explanation when you're just getting into the space, which is like it's a public ledger. And when I think of public ledger, I just think of sort of entries in a book. And maybe that's appropriate for, the initial blockchain applications like Bitcoin, which are really just transfer of funds. But when I think about Ethereum, and especially in the context of smart contracts, I think what's a more appropriate analogy is that the blockchain isn't just a ledger; it's more like a computer. It's sort of a virtual computer which exists on this distributed network of machines that validate the blockchain itself, which is the software. And that was really interesting, and I think that's an important sort of educational piece, which is understanding that the blockchain isn't just recording information; it's actually performing functions, and those functions are smart contracts, essentially.
Yeah, I think what I had, like a good example of something I had read was I think the insurance ones make a lot of sense, where if you're Farmer John and you're expecting some crop yield, you can buy insurance to say, basically look at like average temperature in your area. Mm-hmm. And like, let's say you're just not going to get rain and it's going to be really hot and your crops aren't going to grow as you expect. A smart contract could be like basically insurance on that, of like, the smart contract will reference something that I guess is called an oracle, which is basically a source that it can reach out to verify, in this case, like the temperature. So it's an agreed upon source of truth. and that sort of had me thinking, right? Because like I think one of the benefits of blockchain that they'll boast when you sort of generally search it is it helps prevent fraud because of the fact that it's decentralized. Like it's not a bunch of people. It's harder to mess with, right? But we sort of see that like people with a great amount of power can influence things in indirect ways. So I'm a little hesitant to sort of believe that, fraud disappears. And would the fact that it's less clear to find, to me, it feels like it might be a little less direct to find the answer to some of these questions, right? So as a fraudster, if I can become successful, that seems pretty good for me. That was pretty vague and pretty blanket, but I did have some thoughts on the first thing that you were saying, where right now we're in the what is it, the oligopoly of
exactly
of big tech, and it makes me think if I'm a creator, right, and I want to publish something and I don't want to get hit with fees, that's one of the trickier portions here, and also have somebody control sort of what's allowed, what's not allowed, regulate that. At least looking at today's landscape, it's very hard to become known without being on one of those platforms. And it's very hard to see a future where those platforms aren't doing that continuously. So although this idea of like the network effect, right, is there's an algorithm behind it and it's showing you what you want to see or what it thinks you want to see. So when that disappears, how do new creators get found would be sort of my concern. Is like there's partly a reason why this type of technology of like that the I don't know, one of the technologies behind it would be like Spotify often uses like a collaborative filtering type algorithm where it says you like this, you'll also like this. And I feel like for those companies, it was seen as like this is an advancement where we can get people to engage more and help them find things that they might also like. So if you pull that away because there's not one entity or set of entities doing that, how do you get found as a creator or something like that on a blockchain?
Yeah, so I think my thought on that one is that, I mean, so first of all, when I think about network effects, I'm really just considering the size of the network that you're publishing on, not whether or not they have an algorithm to sort of propagate your content. It's really just that there's a lot of people who visit this ecosystem, and so there's a lot of potential eyes that can see your content or read your thoughts or whatever you're publishing. Yeah. And so the difference, I would say, my expectation is that if you have a blockchain social network, for example, that you want to publish your opinions on, it's not that there won't be an algorithm to suggest content for people. It's that the workings of that algorithm will be a part of the blockchain and they'll be completely transparent to the users of that blockchain because they're on a distributed virtual machine. So, the current case is that, you're subject to rules that could get you demonetized. Sometimes you disagree with those. Maybe there's not clarity, or if the algorithm changes and all of a sudden your YouTube video is not getting as many views as it would have gotten previously, you're sort of just in the dark, and maybe you can discuss with YouTube what's going on with your content, why it's not being circulated. But in the blockchain version of this concept, everything's completely transparent. Like the algorithm recommending your stuff is visible. There's no central owner. So I think that's the difference. And sort of, I think you're moving toward an idea which sort of surrounds a lot of the questions I have about how this technology will continue to develop, which is the interface, like the interface with a blockchain social media application, or the interface between a user and a blockchain-based video game, for example. I sort of expect that Web 2 will be the critical player between a user and a blockchain application. I think Web 2 is sort of the gateway to get access to a bunch of these potential Web 3 applications. But I don't really know what that looks like, and I'm not close enough to the technology itself to understand even how to get a glimpse into one of these, ledgers. One of these, I don't know what, I'm told that it's transparent, but I don't know how to look at it, and
Yeah.
I don't know where that information is stored, and it's probably just because I'm not like a fluent user. But when I think of a blockchain-based social media application, my question is like, okay, social media is still filtered through centralized owners, like for smartphones, for example. If you're going to access social media on your Apple iPhone, you're going to have 30% take rate because you have to build an Apple app. And so, what's the access point side of this? How do people engage with these applications, and what does that look like from a user standpoint? The only way that these applications actually gain the network effects that they need to start to take back some of the user base from the oligopoly is that they're easy to use, and I don't think that's the case right now. And at least if it is, it's not broadly assumed to be the case. I don't get the feeling that people know how to interact with these networks.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think when you interface with something on your phone, it's oftentimes an app. Like you can go on a browser on your phone and do that ordeal, but there are certain things that are lost. I mean, the first is you're going to have like margins, but you could make a web app look like a regular mobile app on the web, but it's not going to have all the features. Like you can sort of tap into system level features from a mobile app, like notifications and that type of stuff, which doesn't quite work as well on web. There are sort of natural blockers in the devices that mobile's largely, I feel like, the main device that folks are spending the most time on to interact with the internet.
Yeah, I wonder, just sort of thinking out loud, I hadn't thought about this before, but I wonder if this access point question becomes an opportunity for a sort of next generation of businesses to, like, maybe the blockchain social media application exists on the web, and then there's a third-party company that enables access with a classical iPhone app or something, and so that they're subject to the take rates, but the publishers aren't, and then they have to develop some sort of revenue generation model, being the access point to the Web3 social media application. I'm not sure how that would work, but just sort of a thought. And so the transparency question is interesting. You talked a lot about anonymity, and I'm really curious about that point, actually. So I think when I hear about some people talk about blockchain, they sort of disregard the anonymity point. And I'm curious, like, is anonymity, is it permissible for a large scale financial system? Is that even, can you build a successful, feasible financial business under the pretenses that your user base is anonymous? Does that work? Or do you need to have some sort of identification association to the public keys? And if you have two of these businesses competing, which one's more likely to sort of grip the greatest network effect?
Yeah. That's tricky, right? Because, I mean, when something bad in that realm were to occur or fraudulent, then litigation would follow, right? And if all you have is like hash or like hexadecimal, like here's an identifier.
How do you sue that?
How do you follow up, right? And I think from a blockchain perspective, they're saying like everything's okay and agreed upon, from like if we're talking from a smart contract standpoint where, parties that interact with it say, yeah, I'll agree to this, and, the outcome is the outcome. But that's where I was like, it feels like if you're a proficient fraudster and you can influence maybe these oracles that are defining the conditions of the contract, that's where I would imagine a lot of today's litigation comes into play. Is like, you know, I don't know, like an example would be, I don't know if it's necessarily litigation, but like the Elon Musk payout was like, he basically delivered on what he said. I don't think he did it in a fraudulent way, but people were like, are we actually going to do that?
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's that wasn't the best example, but there are scenarios where I would imagine like the statement of work, if you will, is the box is checked, but people are unhappy about that and would like to disagree.
Yeah.
And I think as humans, there's sort of like there's a natural spot for that. Like what we define is not always correct.
Yeah, and related to that is like, what were the pretenses of the contract when it was signed? You know, were people under fair pressures to agree to that contract? And if there's no way to arbitrate after the fact, then there's potential abuse or manipulation, even when it just comes into the initial statement of the agreement.
Yeah.
Smart contracts I don't think would allow. Yeah, it depends on power, right? And I also don't know the limitations of smart contracts. Like, you know, you think about this instant transaction where inputs are met, outputs are immediately executed.
Yeah.
But what if in the inputs there's some, I don't know if this is even feasible, but what if in the inputs there's some layer of further validation, like all parties agree at one point, and then the inputs are met, and then there's some additional level of, I don't know, approval or something. It's sort of against the value of the instant transaction or the instant execution. But yeah, that's interesting.
I think those are some of the other benefits of blockchain that you'll see too. Speed.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Which I feel like it's often caveated by the fact that it's like, depends how popular this gets. Because at the end of the day, you sort of need the compute power to, you know, keep up with the demand, which if you have a bunch of different companies acting as banks and, you know, doing what they do today, I mean, they don't really guarantee speed. They say that your transfer will be done in a few days unless you take this other option where we'll fee you or something like that. That's talked about as a benefit, and as well, I mean, think about it less in the US, but internationally, like, it can be difficult to get a bank account for all individuals. So it provides a financial outlet for people, which, I mean, I don't think is as prevalent for individuals in the US. Maybe it is, and I'm just not one of those individuals not exposed to it.
Yeah.
And, ignore my ignorance. But yeah, I think those are some good benefits. There's another couple applications that I think are interesting to think about when I was taking a peek at smart contract use cases is arbitrage type board deals. And not only arbitrage, but there are some scenarios where without a smart contract, you can't exchange one token for another. Because they're on different exchanges is like my understanding.
Oh,
so you could basically put up something and say, I'm willing to offer this much of this token for another token, and seek somebody out that's looking for the opposite.
If you didn't want to use a fiat intermediary,
something like that. Like let's say you have token. Some amount of some token, but the token you're looking for is not on Coinbase or something like that. Then the Ethereum network can be leveraged to perform that transaction, get you access to different currencies.
Yeah, and that underwrites the arbitrage case, right? Where it's like two different exchanges, one currency, price difference. You can immediately borrow and then execute this arbitrage activity and take a little slice off the top. And it's like, it's kind of interesting in that regard. But that's like the classic, like, oh, here's where smart contracts are great, is we have this instant arbitrage case. And the example I've come across is like, oh, you have the inputs to this contract. They're stipulated in such a way that the contract will not execute unless it's profitable. And then you have this instant borrowing mechanism also, so that you can borrow $10 million, whatever, buy currency on one exchange, sell it on the other, repay your initial borrow, and then take whatever the difference is. And that's interesting. I think that's interesting because it's simple and relatable. One thing I'm really interested in is native applications of decentralized finance. We can think about insurance or even social media. The word that I've learned recently in this field is skeuomorphic. These are like applications that already exist that we think we could do on this new technology. But I think the real benefit of the technology will come in ways that don't exist yet. And so in Chris Dixon's book, he mentions this example that when the printing press was first invented, it was used to print the Bible in text that very much looked like handwriting. And in no way did the people who invented the printing press understand that it would eventually be used to like sway elections and public opinion. Like it wasn't, that wasn't even a feasible thing to do yet. And so understanding the sort of unknown unknowns of possibilities in blockchain technology, once, if you forget network effects blockages, is interesting. And I think those are like the real gold ideas, those use cases that we're sort of unaware of. And so of course there's more similarities to this in Web 1 too. So Web 1 was essentially a bunch of newspapers. It was like you're reading magazines on your computer screen instead of buying the actual magazine. But now it's like social media is a thing, online gaming is a thing. There's all of these different applications that weren't even conceived of yet. And I think there's room for that on blockchain. I just don't really, obviously I don't know what it looks like. It doesn't exist yet. But it's an interesting angle to approach the technology from, which is what could we do with this type of distributed computer system, distributed machine that's not feasible in the current paradigm. And so like keeping an eye out for those types of visionaries, I think is really important.
Yeah.
So like we were talking about blockchain for arbitrage or whatever, insurance, all of these things. And it's interesting because you use those arguments to argue for the value of the technology to people who may not be aware of it or as open to it. But I don't think that's the value of the technology. I think the value of the technology doesn't exist yet. I don't think it's really stated yet.
Yeah, and I think that's what brings about some of the confusion. Like if you equate it to what exists today, like, well, it's already there.
Yeah.
Or like there's some argument that it will like make it better, like home buying or something like that. Where I don't know, feels like there's probably I gotta imagine there's an application out there that's trying to make that easier.
Yeah, I think that was one of Jaspo's graduate projects, right? Or one of the things he was working on after law school.
Yeah. But I don't know how the blockchain would make that easier or redefine how that's done. Which is tricky because I feel like for technology like artificial intelligence, people are a little more outspoken about here's what could change. It almost feels a little easier to see what's going to change. I mean, I'm sure there'll be things that surprise us, but there's people like, oh, well, it will cure cancer. Like it will just solve those problems that we've been battling for a while.
Yeah, would have you believe.
Or it will, drive cars for you, or it will do whatever. Like the applications are a little more, although they're not 100% there yet, some of them, it's like, I don't know, the writing feels like it's more on the wall there. At least for the initial steps.
I think part of the reason that it's easier to understand applications to AI specifically in this new generation of AIs that we all interface with is that they're right in line with the current Web 2 paradigm, which is sort of centralization of power, centralization of information. And so, in the current trajectory of the internet, there will be a few main players in the AI business who sort of own that business, and they'll be the primary access points to these incredible technologies for people to use. And so it's even less like libertarian, I would say. And so in that way, it sort of runs opposite of blockchain. You have one thing that's really attempting to be distributed and trying to gain value in a way that does not at all agree with the current paradigm.
Yeah.
Or mesh with the current paradigm, and this other brand new technology, which is completely in line with the current paradigm, and it wants to sort of own all of this information and disseminate it in ways that it deems appropriate. And I think that probably makes it more relatable. It's easier to understand, or it's like, oh, it's one application. It does, potentially the job of all of these other applications. It can sort of, it's easy to imagine what it could do.
Yeah.
I think it's more familiar. But blockchain is not that. Definitely not that. And smart contracts, especially, this sort of, what I might call like the most modern layer of blockchain, this thing that we're now trying to develop, not we, but people are now trying to develop, is even less understandable because people don't really understand the underlying technology. So it's interesting. Yeah, I think there's also there's a government aspect to blockchain, which is difficult in the United States. I've heard on some podcasts that we don't really have formal legislation around blockchain usage or sort of these decentralized distributed technologies, but the current SEC chair, Gary Gensler, has sort of enacted this legislation by litigation tactic, wherein a lot of blockchain technologies like NFTs are the classic example of this, are being met with some pretty extreme friction from the Securities and Exchanges Commission. And I think that's happening to some degree with large language models and AI. People are trying to enable legislation to slow down AI development, but not nearly to the degree that the United States government is slowing down blockchain development.
Yeah.
And I think that also makes sense, right? If you have 3 companies, we'll say, that are the AI models of the world, it's really easy for the United States to enact, or any government to enact direct control or influence over those 3 companies. The sort of libertarian ideal here is that the more concentrated the power in the private markets, the more concentrated the power in the government too, because the government only needs to, influence these few companies. And that's definitely happening.
Yeah.
And so there's, a lot more friction for the governments of the world to enable blockchain technologies, which distribute this responsibility and really challenge the government influence model.
Yeah. Yeah, that's tricky. I think it definitely makes sense that they'd sort of crack down on blockchain and crypto a bit more because it's harder to influence.
Yeah, it's
and the vectors feel a little, like some of the vectors feel a little clear. Like in the NFT space, like the NFTs are sort of largely, emulating like what you might see as like a valuable piece of artwork or something like that in the real world, or in the non-digital world, I should say. And there's plenty of fraud happening with those as it is.
Yeah, I like that take. I think when I've looked into that specifically, or some of the things that I've heard more recently around NFTs and whether or not they should be treated like they should be regulated, there's the artwork comparison, and I think that's totally valid and important. But I think there's also like the Pokemon card comparison, and it's kind of the same argument. And I think if you make that even smaller, it's probably very much like a cosmetic that you purchase for a video game. So like if you play a video game and you buy a different outfit for your character with real money, I think that's sort of the space where NFTs will actually thrive. I don't think it'll be in these big, maybe it will be in these like super expensive artwork type of applications, but on average, I think it's more appropriate for like, I don't know, you wanted your video game character to look different, or you wanted your your blockchain social media experience to have some effect, some visual effect. I think that's it. More like I think long term that will be the more realistic vision for NFTs. And in that regard, it seems crazy to regulate, skins on League of Legends or something like that. Regulating fraud in major art is a big deal, but NFTs as a topic, I think, are much more nuanced than a lot of people give them credit for.
Do you think we're steering toward a world where people are, how do I say, more immersed in like a digital world as opposed to a physical world?
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. And look no further than the Meta glasses to build an opinion on there. There's so much incentive for large companies or even small, for any company to innovate around a different device, a different application of a device that enables access to the internet, because the phone is like the most profitable thing of our time. It's like the pocket supercomputer. To be able to chip into that market in an innovative way that makes people not use their phones is the next, is a very, very enticing opportunity. And so if I'm thinking about applying that to NFTs, if you have a supercomputer in your glasses, for example, then NFTs are all of a sudden extremely relevant. Like they're your outfit, maybe, if everyone's using glasses and, maybe fashion accessories or whatever your business looks like on the side of the road. All of these have NFT, types of relationships, and that can be owned by the people who make the glasses, or it can be distributed across the blockchain. But that's going to be relevant for sure. Virtual cosmetics, I think, is a huge thing that will happen once we move off of phones and onto wearables, or whatever that balance equilibrium looks like.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm fully in agreement of people wanting to wear like a wearable glasses that gives them that. I think there are some points that good old Zuck mentions that I could agree with. Like, one of the transitions that has occurred is moving from phone calls to FaceTimes, where, I live across the country from my family. It's really nice to be able to see them and interact with them. But the natural next step is to be next to them.
Yeah.
And like
in a virtual room.
Yeah, interacting with them in a very unique way that's more memorable than seeing them on a 2x4 inch flat screen.
Yeah. Tom has a small phone for anyone listening to
Yeah, I went with the smallest. So I guess it makes sense that I would hold this opinion that I don't think everybody's going to be walking around with glasses. Partially because, there's a lot of people that don't wear glasses, though the rates of myopathy are growing substantially, which is kind of interesting. And that might be promoted by the fact that people are having to look at small text more often and, close up, that type of thing. But over half the population is still not myopic. They're not needing to be equipped with a physical handicap. So having to wear something all the time, like, I don't know, a watch is one thing, but a glasses type solution, I think is a trickier sell, unless we can make it even smaller, which
exactly.
I don't doubt that we'll be able to do.
I think that last point is really what I think about when I consider the next generation of smart devices, or whatever the phone turns into or is balanced against. It's probably, glasses are a tough sell for the reasons you mentioned, and I think that just states that there's no viable, current technology or device that sort of does everything you want it to and is also comfortable and something you want to engage with. And so I think it's really just a matter of time before innovation gets to a point where wearing the thing or whatever the thing isn't as big a deal. And then there'll also be like a network effects, sort of drive to adopt that technology too. Sort of once a critical threshold is met, then you'll want to participate in those networks if they're engaging in applications that are relevant to what you like.
Yeah.
And so, maybe wearing glasses becomes less of an ask if it's like really enabling you to live your life in a way that makes better sense to you or that you like. Yeah, I don't know if glasses are the answer. There's like, on the fringes, there's like these brain implantations and stuff, like neural net and stuff. So there's a lot of different ways that could look, and I don't know what it'll look like, but I'm confident that at some point the phone will be balanced against something else. And then I think it's just a matter of network effects and generational adoption. So like, our generation, we didn't have smartphones as kids, but once people have smart goggles or whatever it ends up being as children, it'll be really natural to wear that thing. And so developing that space is like the potential gain is incredibly high, and owning the network effect for the first, successful device on that market, becoming the next iPhone or whatever, is going to be so important for whoever does it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it'll happen. The sort of bringing it back down to the topic of the day, the follow-up question is, how will that be interfaced with blockchain applications, and what will be the incentive for the company who owns the wearable technology to allow an interface with blockchain technologies? If they can just own the ecosystem, why wouldn't they? And why would they enable a split, toward distributed networks?
Yeah. Where are they making their money at that point? Yeah. If they're not collecting their fees, which, provide for the company, or, I don't know. I would imagine this would have some advertising implications. Like all their revenue streams could be really torn up. So maybe it's the abolition of enterprise and the creation of, at least from a creator perspective and the network perspective, maybe it is direct to consumer type world.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's still got to be an interface, and that company is going to make some serious dough.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think that sort of brings me to the piece of this conversation that I have the least input on and the most curiosity on, which is like DAOs, decentralized. What's the A stand for? Something organizations, decentralized. Oh fuck!
Yeah, there was a hack on like a Ethereum smart contract by some DAO. It was like a very large sum of money where they basically had to. I think that was one of the downfalls of smart contracts and blockchain, is that when there is a hack, it can be pretty tricky to fix. Like they had to fork.
From Ethereum Classic, right? That was the Classic split. Yeah. I'd love to learn more about that.
Don't look to me for DAO.
No, yeah, I guess my curiosity is around the function of DAOs, because that's sort of like the smart contract business, right? You have an organization which is somehow still distributed, but it's profiting from a product, which is a network of smart contracts that are enabling some, product for consumers. But there's a disconnect there for me, which is like, how do you have a DAO, which is an organization itself? Organizations are centralized, but how do you then bridge the gap toward this decentralized network, or sort of how are decisions made? How do you get the benefits of a distributed network if it's sort of controlled by this centralized system of people, right? Because DAOs are just it's just like companies essentially working with smart contracts to enable products for users. How does that work? I'm just sort of, there's a lot more research I need to do there.
Yeah, I'm going to be guessing here because I'm pretty uneducated on this topic.
Yeah,
but I don't know, as an individual interacting with the blockchain, I'm not distributed.
Right.
So maybe these are just, I don't know, organizations of individuals that interact with something that is distributed. And yeah, that would be my guess, is maybe there are things that are sort of monolithic or not distributed, but they're interacting with something that's distributed, which solves for what we have today versus what they can provide. But
yeah, that makes sense.
That's a theoretical stab.
Yeah.
And pretty blanket statement as well.
It's an inquisitive podcast. There's a guy I grew up with.
Asking questions, at the very least.
There's a guy I grew up with, maybe one of the smartest people I grew up around. And a few weeks ago, actually a couple months ago now, he sort of declared, or his company sort of went public with their smart contracts organization, and so it's this lending protocol to enable cash flow essentially to Ethereum-based businesses. And so it's an investing protocol in the smart chain network, and so or smart contract network. And so it's the reason that I wanted to learn about smart contracts, and it's also the only thing or one of the few, maybe many things that I didn't get around to really understanding, which is like, how is that business working? What's that model like? How are they getting paid out from this? It's got to be, there's some token, I'm sure, that's being created. But it's interesting space. It also sort of begs the question, going back to how we started this conversation, which is like, for me, how the hell do you build a smart contract? How does it get added to the Ethereum network? What are the barriers to entry there to get your thing added to the Ethereum virtual machine? What are the costs associated with that type of integration? I don't know.
Yeah, for our non-video folks, I'm just shaking my head. Not
and for our video folks, what camera have you hacked? Because there's no video.
Yeah, it'll be fine once it's on the blockchain, they'll understand.
There you go. I think we've exhausted our expertise, or lack thereof.
That's correct. I don't want to drive any more misinformation at this point.
Well, the prerequisite to each of these conversations is that this is a learning opportunity for us.
Yeah, this one, I don't know how successful we were in the learning department. Maybe a little more research on both sides would have helped, but I don't know. I think it'll become more prevalent based off of some of the applications that I see, and the fact that there's just, I don't know, a lot of issues in litigation currently happening with these sort of monopolistic type corporations, where a distributed solution seems like a nice way to band-aid that, or not band-aid it, but resolve those types of issues that are sort of popping up. Once somebody gets some power, they continue to get more and more and more.
Yeah, that's the network effect. Well, it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to sort of understand how people get rich just by voting the technology, or squander their money by voting the technology. However the dice roll. I guess it's either you're buying Ethereum and Bitcoin, or you're not. For the passive user, or or non-user.
Yeah, or you're trying to sniff out the next big token. But
that's what. Yeah, I mean, like, cannot recommend. I think, like, if that's probably pretty prevalent, is people treating crypto as sort of a casino, where it's like what horse you're gonna bet on.
Yeah, but I mean, props to companies like Coinbase, where they have sort of educated things built into the tool where they'll say we'll give you some of this token if you learn about its purpose.
That's cool. I didn't even know that.
Which is, it's fun, but I've done them and I couldn't tell you about any of these tokens. Like you forget it. And there's not, I mean, I don't think it's the medium, like I don't know, the what they've developed is pretty well put together. There's a lot of like visionary or like image-based learning. Like you're not just like reading text and being like, yeah. Like they have you sort of do a little quiz at the end. Make sure you understand it before they give you, 3 cents of some coin.
Yeah.
Or whatever it's worth by the time you're done.
Yeah, maybe it was.
But I've done that, or like a couple of years ago during the pandemic, I think I did a couple of those. And I was like, I'm learning about tokens. But then you asked me like a week after, I probably would have forgotten.
Yeah.
About a particular token. But yeah, if I look at my wallet, I have like a good coin collection.
Dude, from these tutorials.
From tutorials, but they're all just like tiny amounts. But at some point in time, I was just like, oh, it's clever usage for a token. But it definitely feels like, the two you mentioned are still the big two. And I don't quite understand how Bitcoin is still, well, I guess it's still more prevalent because it was, I don't know.
It's like 10 years older.
Yeah.
Or something around that.
And Ethereum's not really going to see as much prospect until it's, leveraged by more users.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the difference there is virtual machine versus distributed ledger, right? Bitcoin really is just sort of, I think it's sort of become a place to store value.
Yeah.
Whereas Ethereum wants to be a place to build businesses, commerce.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll see how that ends up. I know that there was a lot of development in Ethereum that sort of overcame some of the initial resistance. So like there was a huge anti-crypto movement around energy consumption for a while Ethereum was still proof of work. I won't pretend to know. I still don't quite understand proof of work versus proof of stake. But what I've read in Chris Dixon's book is that transition to proof of stake reduced the energy demand for Ethereum to be essentially negligible.
Yeah. Yeah, at some point I read up on that. That's gone now.
Yeah, back when they were making that switch, it was big news. But now it's like, I forget.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of environmental concerns that have come around crypto, whether it be that or the just mining of like Bitcoin, trying to find.
Yeah, but now that we need full data centers to enable AI applications, no one seems to be talking about energy consumption. It's like,
no, yeah,
I don't know. When it's easy to understand the impacts of the technology, things like energy consumption seem to not make as much of a splash. But yeah, like for Ethereum itself, I don't think energy consumption is really a concern anymore.
Yeah, I also think that it's a little more out of the public eye now. Like,
yeah,
from a marketing perspective, crypto was going crazy for a while, and I feel they're spending a little less money on marketing now. So they're not like, now the marketing money is going towards these AI products.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So we talk about what we see.
Yeah, the prices now are pretty close to the all-time highs for the two big blockchains, though, right? I think they're getting there. I haven't looked, but I think they've crept back up.
Maybe
substantially.
Yeah, it varies on the day, but I think I don't know. I think Ethereum's not as high as it's been.
Okay. Yeah. We'll see what happens. All right, we're at an hour. Anything else you wanted to throw into this one? Just shake around.
Yeah. I'll throw one more thing.
Yeah, let's hit it.
I guess to spin off our conversation of smaller technology and that becoming more prolific. One thing that I've picked up in the past week that gives me more confidence that we'll ascertain that type of thing is I watched a little deep dive on SSDs, solid state drives. And the way those work is actually insane in the fact that we're able to manufacture them. They have billions, if not trillions, of memory cells, and each of these memory cells have technology in them called an electron trap. And that's basically how memory works: is it's taking a set number of electrons, storing it in a trap, and it'll be there when you read it. And if you write to it, we can move it electrons around. But they're brilliant because the charge or the number of electrons that you have in a trap can stay the same for, say 10 years without any issue. So it's sort of a marvel that we're able to like keep something in its place. And the way that these work is all based on quantum mechanics equations from like the 1920s. Yeah. We just were able to better manufacture these electron traps and figure out how to, engineer a solution with those equations sort of, later down the line, whether it be, 60, 70 years later or whatever. But the tidbit that was most impressive to me about the manufacturing bit there is the divider that's used for the electron trap. In order to work and abide by these equations, the thickness of these dividers have to be somewhere in between, or they have to be like precisely in between 75 and 100 atoms in thickness.
There's an upper limit? Is that for efficiency? Because I can understand the lower limit being due to tunneling, right? Because the electrons will just go through the thing if it's too small. But the upper limit, is that just to maintain like the cell size essentially?
Yeah, now you're asking me how that quantum equation works.
Sorry.
I would imagine that there's a means to apply some voltage to allow electrons to flow through and not flow through. And I think as it gets too thick, that breaks down.
That makes sense. Yeah.
That's a bit of a guess, but I think that's where it's at. But it's incredible to me that we're manufacturing multiple, like, order of larger than trillions of these dividers at that small a scale. It's like, what an intensely small technology to mass produce. So
yeah, and quality control. Yeah, I mean, manufacturing, everything that goes into manufacturing is a miracle. It's incredible that we can manipulate material in this way.
And I mean, part of that too is it's not perfect, right? There are blemishes when we manufacture these things, and it's just sort of accounted for. Or there's devices that go in and try and fix the blemishes afterwards. But that approach to manufacturing makes me think, like, if we're building things that small already, we'll have something that, people won't mind wearing, that provide for the next level experience.
Yeah, I like that take. This is going to go way off topic now, but where my mind went when we're thinking about manufacturing things that small and repairing blemishes on those technologies, like nature did this with proteins essentially, right? Nature operates in a larger structure dimensionally. Proteins are, many more than hundreds of atoms.
Yeah.
But the information efficiency and genetic code, repairing that genetic code, influencing how it all works, like there's some really interesting alternatives that we don't consider because they're not rigid and they're very hard to install. But this is sort of close to my heart because I read there's some Substack article I read a few weeks ago, and the title of it is "Why Haven't Biologists Cured Cancer Yet?" which is provocative, of course. And so, like, the comparison is biology moves at drug development moves at this glacial speed with respect to sort of computational technology, where we've gone with this Moore's law paradigm, which has just completely changed the way the world works. So, like, where's the benefits? Why aren't we better at biological research or drug development? We've done so well in computer manufacturing engineering, I think that it really comes down to complexity. Like, these are incredibly complex devices that we're manufacturing now, and I think they are absolutely tiny in comparison to the complexity of a biological organism. And so that's just like really incredible to think about. If the fact that we can build these things from start to finish, that if we wanted to, we could build a single schematic that describes this device in its entirety, a solid state drive or a CPU or what have you. We have nothing close to that for biological or for single cell organisms. It's like, if you think of a single cell as a state machine, describing the state of that cell, phosphorylation states, concentrations of proteins, concentrations of small molecules, sizes of polymers, the complexity is remarkable. It's so much more than we can physically manipulate.
Yeah, that's super tricky. Yeah, I feel like in the tech world, there's just such great microscopic building blocks.
It's rigid. It's rigid, right? There's rigidity and it's controlled. It's very much controlled.
Yeah. Like, if you were to compare a transistor to a mitochondria, like, transistors smaller.
Yeah,
which is
by a lot. Yeah.
Just, it's wacky. Like, the level of just tininess.
Yeah.
To tech. It's bonkers.
Yeah. So maybe the tech wearable will be some manufactured organism that you stick in your ear. It translates language for you.
Maybe. There you go. That's the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
That's
right.
I
got you.
Yeah. All right.
It's coming.
Yeah, not from my lab.
Nice. Well, it's been a pleasure to talk with you, John. I've been Tom.
Yeah, I've been John. This is Hark 3 on smart contracts and anything else.
Yeah.